Welcome into a new edition, a roster cut edition of the Going Deep Buffalo podcast on the Built-in Buffalo Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kevin Massare, here with Kevin Siracuse and special guest Dave Myers to go through not only roster cuts, predictions, what can happen on this roster going forward, who's safe on the roster, who may not be, some practice squad discussion, all of our news, notes, and thoughts on the depth chart, and a lot of different news. Maybe stuff will break as we're on air. Has happened many times for us here. And we're here. We're glad to be here with you on a Tuesday. I know it's a day early, but we wanted to talk down this roster and what's going to happen. But as always, this show is brought to you by the Summit Center for some of the best autism care in Western New York.
Tonight's show is also brought to you by Dave Dengler and the Larson-Timko Funeral Home in Fredonia. Larson-Timko Funeral Home offering 100% fully guaranteed price and pre-arranged funeral plans with live streaming available. You can give them a call at 716-679-9000 or visit their website at larsontimkofuneralhome.com.
So, what a busy day. Busy day. Roster news were coming a little quicker than I can remember. Last year, they actually held on to it pretty tightly. I went back and looked when we were planning out this show. The roster actually came out at 6 p.m. from the official tweet from the Bills. And obviously, there's always 5 to 6 to 7 players and or moves that aren't leaked, as the case was this year. But at least it came out around 5:15 today, so about 2 hours ago. The Bills released their roster and their cuts. And some surprises. They made one trade, making a player trade for a draft pick swap, late draft pick swap next year. So that was pretty interesting. We'll get into that in a moment. And we'll take a look at the released players now. Kevin, we'll start with you. You have anything that's popping out to you right off the bat of a player's cut? I know you are a Kingsley Jonathan guy. You were trying to sneak him on our roster prediction. He's probably, Tyrell Shavers, both of us left him off our roster prediction. We got 50 out of 53 correct. Obviously, we weren't going to get the returner swap. That was never going to be a prediction, anyone would have made. We actually did have La'el Collins making the roster. He's on the list here. So obviously, he's one of our, cuts. And then Daquan Hardy. Being the one player swapped out, kind of surprising as you look at it. And then Zach Davidson didn't make it. The Bills went super light, 5 receivers, 3 running backs, 3 tight ends. It's 11 weapons. And then obviously Reggie Gilliam, I don't really consider him a weapon. I consider him an offensive special teamer. But you have 11 skill players for Josh Allen, probably toward the lightest end in the league, I would assume, as you add up that. So Kevin, what are some initial reactions you had from this cut list?
My initial reactions are overall, I'm happy with this squad. Like, I'm one of those people, I'm a visual person. So once I see it all condensed, I'm like, all right, here we go. Here's our team for the year. Let's go. Let's get us to September 8th. But there are a few things that stick out to me because we've had some questions going into today right along. And I don't know if those questions got answered. Backup quarterback. We still don't know what's happening with Mitch Trubisky. They released Ben DiNucci and Anthony Brown. And there wasn't a corresponding move, so you'd like to think that Trubisky can be healthy. Same thing with Quentin Morris. We originally thought, we're talking to Dr. Trimble last week, Banged Up Bills. He was saying that Quentin Morris could be an IR candidate. Then McDermott said that everyone should be ready for week 1 outside of Matt Milano. So you say, okay, maybe Quentin Morris can be back, but maybe he's not going to be 100%. Maybe they will stash him on IR. Maybe that's good for Zach Davidson. Well, Zach Davidson got cut, and I really thought that they were going to keep him because as we saw the news coming in that they were getting rid of these wide receivers with Tyrell Shavers, KJ Hamler, Justin Shorter, obviously with Chase Claypool, I thought, okay, between them not seeming to want a 6 wide receiver and a banged up Quentin Morris, at least he's not 100%, I think this should bode pretty well for Zach Davidson. And maybe this is the year that they roll with 5 wide receivers, 4 tight ends plus Reggie Gilliam, and they got rid of Zach Davidson too. And then for the cherry on top, I was really confused with the Daquan Hardy release. And then they made that trade. I apologize. I can't remember his first name because it's been such a quick turnaround. But Broderington, what was his name?
Yeah, so if you pull up the defensive depth chart, which we'll get to in a second, Brandon Codrington.
Yeah, Brandon Codrington. So he's essentially a Hardy replacement. And I thought he was looking really good. Hardy, that is. I thought he was really impressing this summer. So, again, overall, I'm happy. I don't think the needle moves on cut down day that much. I think the Bills are still the Bills. They still have Josh Allen. But all my questions weren't answered today.
Okay. Dave, what are some of your immediate notes that you see from this roster? And I think I have some idea on where you might go, but couple of those other surprising names, as Kevin brought up. I mean, we see Hardy here, as we've talked about, Kingsley Jonathan, La'el Collins. The Bills, the funny part, I talked about it on the show, $1.5 million to eat his salary. It's not nothing. Not only that is you're rostering another player in his place. So you cut the player, 1.5 million dead, and then $700,000, $800,000, $900,000 as well on top of it to not have this guy on your roster. So what are some of your immediate reactions as we look through the cuts list?
Yeah, you mentioned La'el Collins. Like, I thought for the lack of reps that he got in the preseason finale that he was a lock. And the contract, like you said, the dead cap, we've already accrued so much dead cap this season, obviously with Diggs and all that. But to me, there's two that stand out. And I was pounding the table for KJ Hamler. And I know everybody's going to say that we kept 5 receivers last year, and that would have been the 6th receiver. But I really liked the versatility that he brought in showing what he was able to do in that preseason finale. You need me to run the ball, I'll run the ball. We know he can do returns. And from what Coach, spoke about him every press conference was that he brought the juice. He was a guy that was just one of those lunch pail guys that they ask him to do something, and he's going to go out there and do it. And then Daquan Hardy, me and Kevin Massare, we were talking about this before we came on. It's a little confusing because I thought that he had a path to the roster. I really did think that he showed some flashes during preseason from what we've heard about his production in camp and how he performed. And we haven't heard anything come out that says that he's not a great fit for the locker room. He's not a process guy, any of that stuff. So those two kind of baffle me a little bit. We'll see what happens with practice squad and stuff like that. But I also brought this up before we came live is Casey Toohill, injured a little bit during camp. We haven't really saw him on the field or haven't really seen him on the field. I know he's a veteran, but he doesn't have a ton of production when he was with the Commanders. I know he stepped in a little bit when they had some injuries and he showed some signs of flashes. So I guess the way that they're constructing the defensive line and the rest of that side of the ball, it looks like he's going to be an important cog in that rotation. So other than that, a couple small things here and there, but I do feel like it's not set yet, right? I do feel like this was to get to 53, and I know that in the next coming maybe 7, 8, 10 days, there will be a little bit of movement. Teams will drop guys. The Bills will pick guys up. They'll have some guys that they'll release and do some stuff like that. They always do that. But other than that, other than the wide receivers just dropping like flies to start the day, I was a little concerned. But then I felt comfortable after that. It was this weird, okay, they must feel really good about what they have, which makes me feel good about MVS and Curtis Samuel and their injuries. It makes me feel good because I really think that they value Mac Hollins a lot more than a lot of us value Mac Hollins. I think that he's a guy that they're going to utilize in this offense one way or the other. He's not going to be getting a ton of targets, but I think that they're going to find reps for him to get him involved in the offense. I just do. And he's a vibe. And I think that, he's brought a lot of positive stuff to the team in the locker room. So other than that, I guess we'll see where it goes from here. Like Kevin said, like Kevin Siracuse said, there's still some questions that we haven't answered. We don't know anything about Mitch Trubisky. We don't know if he's ready. He's going to be ready to go week 1 if needed. The wide receiver room, we don't know anything about the injuries with Curtis Samuel and MVS. So that's still questionable. And I thought that some of the offensive linemen that were released, I think you guys both can agree that the ones that were released were ones that we all probably had making the roster, like La'el Collins and possibly Will Clapp, stuff like that. But other than that, it is what it is. These guys get paid to make these decisions. And then we have our opinions, and then we kind of go from there. So, but it's going to be a great conversation to have. I'm really looking forward to it.
I think what first immediate reaction that I have as I'm looking through the roster is at the receiver room. We talked about this on our show over the course of the last weeks, and we then agreed to 5. The room we actually got completely right here when we made our roster predictions was why stash these guys? There's no reason to put Shavers, Hamler. I think they're just guys you can have on your practice squad and eventually, even shorter, depending on what 2 or 3 that they choose to have down there. And you can call them up for free. You can call them up 3 times. If you eventually need to roster one of them for playing really well, then you can still make a roster decision there if there's an injury somewhere. But just because you have a lot of them doesn't mean it's necessary. And I think what it does speak to, though, is the health. You can't roster 5 if 2 of them aren't ready to go week 1. It just doesn't make any sense. The Bills probably still do have some tricks up their sleeve. I do not believe that this is their final roster, as you can see evidenced by even making a short-term tweak like cutting Hardy, who probably would have made the roster, but the Brandon Beane found a trade that he liked for a late round draft swap. Probably wasn't going to clear waivers. Played really, really well. The Bills traded for Brandon Codrington, a guy that looked really good. He's returned a bunch of punts and kicks for touchdowns in his collegiate career. Looked really good in preseason, toward the top of the total yardage in kickoffs. I think second in average in the preseason. Looked really good punt returning and had a lot of juice. So I think the Bills felt really comfortable with what he was able to put on film. And for whatever reason, there was, after complimenting him, Sean McDermott, there was something there that they didn't trust with him in the return game. And thus they felt like they were already heavy enough carrying Cam Lewis and Jamarcus Ingram. They just felt like they were decent at the corner and safety spot that they, Hardy, they wanted to go a different direction with the return game. And they probably feel like Hardy's going to clear through to waivers. I would imagine so. And then he'll be able to be put back onto the practice squad and then able to elevate if needed. I would believe that that's the Bills' ultimate game plan there when it comes to Hardy. So that's going to be really something to track throughout times. But I want to bring up now, we'll start on the offensive side of the ball, and then we'll taper the defensive talk for a moment. And we kind of started at the receiver room. We've talked about that, but 2 injuries. I think that they'll be healthy on that front. Tylen Grable did everything possible to make this roster, and he did. And looking every bit as much as your next, developmental left tackle. He played really well against the 2s and 3s at the left tackle spot. He's really never relinquished that role. And then obviously Van Pran Granger, Alec Anderson, Ryan Vandemark, really young. Osiris Torrance, obviously Spencer Brown's still pretty young himself. And Edwards and McGovern really aren't that old either. So it's a really young offensive line group that I'm expecting big things from. Kevin, are you pretty impressed with this depth? And to Dave's point earlier of having to cut Collins and Clapp, and then maybe Richard Garage was another guy they had handpicked and probably right down to the wire on the Richard Garage decision. Are you impressed by this youth on this offensive line, the depth, and then probably sticking 1 or 2 of those 3 we just mentioned on their practice squad? And I'll get to my practice squad in a minute, but that offensive line is looking pretty solid. And obviously that's not even factoring Kincaid, Knox, and Morris.
Yeah, it's still solid, but I would be more comfortable if they had at least one of those veterans between La'el Collins and Will Clapp. And when I was talking about things that confused me, I think I forgot to mention that. Dave did mention it when he was talking about just like the overall view of these cuts. But outside of backup quarterback, wide receiver / tight end, and the swap of Daquan Hardy for Brandon Codrington, that's another big question right there. And I know, again, this is probably the 9th or 10th offensive lineman, so it doesn't move the needle that much. But when you look at those backup offensive linemen, Grable, rookie, Van Pran Granger, rookie, Alec Anderson, 2nd or 3rd year, Vandemark, 2nd or 3rd year. So these guys are very young, and we know how the Bills really value that depth and the competition and the veteran leadership. So I was shocked that both of those veterans got cut. I thought they would have kept at least one, if not both. But when I saw that they cut Collins and Will Clapp, I was a little bit surprised.
I thought that they would keep 10 personally.
We had them keeping 10. So I thought they'd kind of want to bulk up on that offensive line, especially for how we think that Joe Peretti wants to run this offense this year.
I think that they'll stash Clapp on the practice squad. I think that that's pretty much the way that I envision that going. So the Bills probably feel like not having to go through waivers. They will have access to him anyways. They probably thought it was way more likely that one of their younger guys wouldn't have been claimed. And I don't think any of these 9 on the roster would have been cut anyway. So the idea was, do we need to roster a 10th? Do we need to have that guy on the roster? They get paid entirely. Their salaries are guaranteed if they're on the 53-man roster for week 1. So all these rosters become guaranteed if you're a veteran at that point. You can't swap them in and out at that stage. It really kills your cap. So the Bills had to make that decision. You saw that with their cap decisions across the roster, as we'll talk about that in a minute here on the defensive side and then my practice squad. But that is a huge thing to remember, that those salaries become guaranteed if you're in veteran status. So You can't do those swaps like you can with like a Spectre or an Andreessen. You can't roster those guys in and out. You have to pay their full salary for the year. So I think that definitely had a role in these decisions, at least for sure on the offensive side of the ball, and definitely with some final decisions on the defensive side of the ball. But an interesting name I want to get your opinion on, Dave. First, tell me about what your thoughts are on the O-line. I think it's super solid. I'm not as worried maybe as needing that vet, especially if you're going to toss Clapp on the practice squad. It's young, it's cheap, it's been effective. It was really good in preseason. All of them have been in the system minus the 2 rookies. I mean, you're looking at a line that's returning 7 of their top 9 last year. And it's probably a strength, and it's going to be a strength in the running game. Are you pretty happy with how this turned out, considering where the offensive line came from in like 2019?
Oh yeah. I mean, Josh, 2018, 2019, it was a disaster. So the offensive line Bean has invested in the trenches, which, he has spoken on several times over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, is the battle. We need to win up front, whether it's offense or defense. There's one guy missing off here, would be Lyle Collins, and I would have got this 100%. And I'm still, like Kevin Syracuse was saying, that, there's no veteran other than the starters. Like, guys that are in their second or third year, we're not going to consider them seasoned veterans, right? So I think this is just more to the youth movement. I think this is all about getting cheaper, getting younger, and maybe they're banking on the fact that last year 98% of the snaps was the starting 5. And maybe they're hoping that this starting 5 can get another 98% of the snaps, and they won't need to rely on a seasoned veteran like a Will Clapp or a Lyle Collins to get ample playing time. But with that being said, I feel okay with the group that we have. I mean, they spent a draft pick on Cedric Van Pran-Granger. Alec Anderson's been in the system. Ryan Vandermark was here last year. David Edwards was here last year. Connor McGovern just moved over. So I'm very confident in the group that they have. They've spent a lot of time scouting this group. They spent a lot of time assembling this group. There's money invested in Deion Dawkins. There's going to be money invested in Spencer Brown. I'm fully on board with the fact that I think that he's playing for his next contract, and hopefully the Bills can have stalwart bookends for the next 4 or 5 years with Spencer Brown and Deion Dawkins. And they spent money on Connor McGovern last year, before last season. So they're investing, right? They invested a second-round draft pick in Osiris Torrance. So I think the investment's there, and we saw it come to fruition last year. The Bills had one of the best offensive lines in the NFL last year, and I do feel like you need to have depth at the offensive line in this position group, because I think the Bills are going to try to run the ball more. And I think they want these types of offensive linemen that can be athletic and get out in space and do things that Joe Brady wants to do. Because that he had to have some sort of say in how somewhat this was assembled. This wasn't just based off of youth or age and contract and stuff like that. There was scheme has to be involved in how they put this backup group together. And like you guys had been saying for the past couple shows, the Bills like to have that first unit of 5. The Bills like to have that second unit of 5. That way they can run practice however they want to run practice with the first 5, the second 5, and keep things moving. So other than that, I mean, there's not a lot on here that I think that, screams, what are we doing? Like all this makes sense. I mean, there's going to be stuff. The Darrington Evans IR thing is a little confusing. And again, me and Kev talked about that before we came on, because I don't think the injury he sustained against the Panthers in the preseason finale was that significant. It didn't seem like it was anything that was that significant. It wasn't really talked about, diagnosed, nobody really went over it after the game. It wasn't seemingly a big thing. So could there have been somebody else that maybe they could have stashed on the IR because he's designated to return? So similar to Matt Milano. So that was a little concerning. Obviously, Darrington Evans has been on other NFL rosters. He's been called up several times throughout his career, so he is technically an NFL running back. And the Bills, maybe that's a way that they can see the health-wise with James Cook, Ty Johnson, Ray Davis, if it lasts throughout the season. If not, you have a guy that you can bring back. But other than that, no, I think overall pretty satisfied with what we have here with the starting or with the offensive roster.
Real quick, I just want to make a point about Darrington Evans. I think that would have been a perfect opportunity. Now, I don't know the severity of Quentin Morris's injury, but if you didn't put Evans on IR, you didn't stash him and just figure, okay, maybe we can get him back on the practice squad. You give that IR designation to Quentin Morris, that gives you the opportunity to keep Zach Davidson. So that's a bit of roster shuffling where I just get a little bit confused, where they're essentially valuing Darrington Evans more than Zach Davidson. And again, we'll see what happens with the practice squad, but the way Davidson's looked, he might get claimed and he could be gone.
Good point by Akeem here. I agree with his veteran point. Like, look, like Will Clapp ultimately is a veteran. I don't think anyone cares. And I think that he's going to sit on the practice squad. He look at what's missing technically on the depth chart would be a left guard, and they like to have a second unit. Will Clapp's going to be on this roster most likely. I guess they could feel like Lael Collins could be it. But one of those two, most likely Clapp, is going to be on this roster on the practice squad and getting second team reps with that unit. If anything ever happened to a guard, I'd envision Clapp being an instant signing, or I guess it could be Collins if that's who they deem to be the 10th offensive lineman. The difference is, just like Fetty did last year when he made the roster and then they caught him and felt pretty confident that no one touched him on their practice squad toward the end of the year when they needed that roster spot after Knox came back. They're going to do the same thing this year. The 10th offensive lineman either can be on your roster. 9 is pretty safe. 8 is pretty lean. So the Bills went at the safe number rather than the overly heavy number. And they decided to, instead of rostering that left guard at backup guard, Will Clapp, he's just going to sit on the practice squad. I'm probably sure that he'll be brought back. It could be Keaton Bills. With the youth here, that I'm assuming that it's going to be Will Clapp that's going to take that guard spot. So I think that's, and ultimately he knows the offense. He was in the offense. He was with the twos all off season. He's the missing link to this graphic. If the Bills had another roster spot, he probably might even be on it. And then Kevin, to your point with Darrington Evans, Quentin Morris, I think Quentin Morris could have been IR'd possibly, but they probably think he's going to be back well before week 4. And the Bills chose to go the other path. Him ready sooner, Evans on the IR instead. Maybe something will happen and we can utilize him. They did use one of their 8 designated for return spots. I thought Evans actually played well enough at times to where I thought he could get claimed and he could go to another team. He's a really good pass catching back. Mike McDaniel, who knows his running backs, has had him up on his active roster at times with all those talented running backs like Devin Achane, and obviously Raheem Mostert. They're always drafting guys over there in Miami. So he was good enough to make that roster. Also, the Bears picked him up the second that the Bills let him go last year. So he definitely has some clout around the league. And the Bills said, you know what? That's probably a 2-week injury. Probably don't want to waste a roster spot on him right now, but what better way to get him in the offense, see if there's any movement. We can bring him back whenever we feel like it after week 4, especially if there's anything going on at running back or even just another injury, and also adds a little bit of that return element for you. You never really done it a lot, but the Bills always seem to think that he's a returner, and he's done it in preseason. So he adds that element to this in case something happens with their new return player. So that's going to be an interesting thing to follow. But they did determine Morris would be more useful for this roster today. And Zach Davidson's now exposed. I think he is one toward the top of the list that another team could take. If you realistically look at it, you're talking about 1,200 players across the league cut, roughly. How many of those are claimable? There's only probably 700 or 800 qualified to be claimed, probably 3 to 4% at most. Is that 1 or 2 from the Bills? So is Zach Davidson that 1 or 2? I would probably have him toward the top of my list personally of somebody that could get claimed with Frank Gore Jr., possibly Daquan Hardy, maybe to Corey Couch. So those are some of the names that I'm looking for. But Kevin, are you worried he gets claimed?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that he has a lot of upside. And when the news was breaking throughout the day that the Bills were just shedding off all these wide receivers, I was like, okay, I think this is going to be good news for Zach Davidson, because I was like, this totally matches up with what we've been saying for months now on this show here on Going Deep Buffalo, that the Bills are undergoing this philosophical change where they want to be not necessarily like that ground and pound team, but they want to use the running game to set up the passing game. And with only 5 wide receivers, I was like, okay, Zach Davidson could really be that 4th tight end. And in this type of offense, that would be the 6th wide receiver, because like Chris Brown and Steve Tasker say, it's like a tight receiver. He's not necessarily a tight end. He's not that good at blocking, and he's a little bit too big to be a wide receiver, but it's kind of like a blend of both, and that's kind of like Dalton Kincaid. So I didn't think that the Bills would want to expose Zach Davidson to waivers, especially considering that Quentin Morris isn't 100% healthy.
Maybe
Very
they
interesting.
felt like they already had their Dalton Kincaid on the roster. I mean, Zach Davidson's a good fit, but you're talking about Quentin Morris. Let's talk about special teams. How much did that have to play into this decision, too? Because Quentin Morris plays special teams, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. Does Zach Davidson, have we seen him out there on special teams? I mean, I know, Kevin Massare, you like to complain about Matthew Smiley and how poor this team covers kick and punt returns. So I don't know if the Darrington Evans thing was a special teams thing, but I would have loved to have Zach Davidson. I thought that he's that guy that would fit in there. And you think at some point, if he makes it back to the practice squad, which I don't think he will, I think that he's gonna get plucked by somebody. But if he does, he will. I absolutely think he'll get called up at some point this year. I think he's got a ton of upside. There's a ton of value there, and that's one of those ones too, because I was thinking the same thing as you were, Cuse, when we were going through the day and all these wide receivers were getting released. I'm like, maybe they're going to go with 4 tight ends. I didn't see that. And when they cut Hamler, I was like, okay, maybe they really are going with 4 tight ends. But at the end of the day, they didn't. So interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to remember is maybe just like any other player, like you saw Shane Buechele do it away from Kansas City last year. Davidson could say, I played well enough to where I think I played at least on my offense. You know, they're valuing special teams here. I don't think Quentin Morris is like everything I heard from him is like he's a good blocker. They're keeping him because he struggles blocking. So I don't like his film's not great. He had a really bad play against the Giants last year. Then obviously had that touchdown at the end, which all Josh Allen. But he was struggling on naked boots. He's struggling to hold his edge. I just, quite frankly, don't really see much from Quentin Morris. He actually is a converted receiver himself. He is a receiver from the MAC. He is not a big bruising tight end. I don't know where, just because he's the 3rd tight end doesn't mean he's the 3rd tight end in stature of being a blocking tight end. That is not his film. That is not where he came from. He does play special teams because he's that bigger body, faster, has some of that athletic ability, and does excel like a big receiver himself on the tight end units, or on the special teams units. Davidson was able to do some of that. He's had a ton of snaps in special teams. But the moral of the story is, I would feel like, okay, you have 2 tight ends already, 1A and really a strong 2. And now you have this Quentin Morris guy. I'm never going to play. So I wouldn't feel bad for him if he's not claimed, to say, you know what, although I might be the 3rd or 4th somewhere else, that 1, 2, and 3 is much weaker than the Bills 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to get on the field way, 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 way quicker. So he could ultimately make that decision as well, Kevin.
Yeah, and I was going to say, if we could just bring up the depth chart one more time, I think the bigger picture here is that Josh Allen has less weapons to work with now, and the weapons that he does have aren't 100% healthy. So that's part of my concern here, because, okay, let's start from the top. Keon Coleman, Matt Collins, they're healthy from what we know. And then you go down, Kincaid, Knox, they're healthy. Quentin Morris is not healthy. James Cook, Ty Johnson, he was banged up. Ray Davis, he's okay. Evans, obviously IR. But then you move down, Shakir, he's been good. Curtis Samuel battling turf toe, and MVS, he has that neck strain. So when you look at the weapons, and you have Curtis Samuel, who could arguably wide receiver 1 in this offense, MVS, and then Quentin Morris, who, yeah, again, it's just a tight end 3, but those are 3 pass catchers right there. And you're only going to have 8 total. So what, right now we only have 5 healthy pass catchers. And I know, James Cook, Ty Johnson, Ray Davis, they can catch passes. And the first game isn't for 12 days away. But still, it just kind of leaves a sour taste in my mouth when essentially with what the Bills were trying to do, they're trying to make it easier for Josh Allen, right? Like they wanted to surround him with more weapons, and it's like a wide receiver by committee. Everyone eats. We're going to take the pressure off of Josh. Well, now you're putting the pressure back on him because you're not giving him as many weapons as possible.
I think what's another point of conversation, Dave, does this roster, I don't think it's done, especially with a GM like Brandon Beane, maybe any GM, but especially we'll go in defense in a minute. Is there a place the Bills can improve, and do you expect them to look at a guy like Terrace Marshall that we had a special guest on the show last week, breaking down what he thought the Bills could make a trade for him? Do you think that, Tim Patrick has already signed on a practice squad deal to Detroit, but do you think that there's another receiver out there that could make sense for the Bills, whether it's Noah Brown or anybody else? Is it receiver? Do you think that they go heavy somewhere else? I just don't. I mean, offensive line's fine, but other than that, I think that the Bills could make a move. Do you feel the same way? Or at least offensively, talking on the offensive side, do you think they stay put?
I think offensively, we're gonna have to find out what happens over like the next probably 5 or 6 days, because we have to remember with the waiver wire, where the Bills sitting at the waiver wire all the way towards the end. So a lot of these guys might not. You talk about Terrace Marshall. There's no way he makes it to the Bills. There's absolutely no way that he makes it that far. So when we start thinking about players like that, you got to think, are they going to make it that far? Is there teams that are going to need wide receivers? But there's a ton of wide receivers out there. And if we're talking strictly offense, I think that's a position you look at. And when I first started talking, like, we're going to wait 5 or 6 days to realize the health of these guys, the health of Curtis Samuel, the health of MVS. Like, are these guys going to be able to go week 1? And if they are, fine. I think that we're fine. That's why I was pounding the table for a 6th wide receiver, just in case. And a guy like KJ Hamler, people might not love him, but what he can do, he offers value to special teams. He offers value to the offense. I think that when Bean signed him right away after the season ended last year to the futures deal, I think that they like what they saw in him. He's a speedy guy. He's a guy that can do a little bit of everything, that Swiss Army knife type guy that they want, which is also similar to Curtis Samuel. And I don't think there was anything that happened in camp or preseason that, maybe the fumble, the muffed punt return that he had. But other than that, I don't think there was anything that he did that made them say, okay, he's absolutely replaceable. I thought he did everything that was asked of him, and he seemed like he was a great locker room and a great presence on this team. But I guess overall, to answer your question, I'm hoping there's maybe something for wide receiver, but then what position group do they take away from? It'd have to be something on defense, because I feel like they're set across the board on offense. It's basically slim pickings all the way across the board there. I don't think you can take anything away from there. It'd have to be one of the corners. I don't think they're going to take away from the defensive line. They ran 10 last year, if I'm not correct, all season. They ran 10 defensive linemen last year. And then linebackers, maybe that's a spot where you can, swap a guy interchangeable in and out, or drop a guy, move a guy to the practice squad, release somebody off the practice squad. But if they're going to make a move, I think it would have to be receiver. And that would have to be somebody where the contract is going to be team friendly, and you're absolutely getting an increase in value over what you currently have. And it would be adding to what you already have, because if you look at the way the roster is constructed right now, with the 5 receivers that they're running with, I feel like those guys can all contribute in their own way. Obviously, you drafted Keon Coleman, you're going to develop him. Curtis Samuel's not going anywhere. You paid him. Khalil Shakir, they've invested now. This is his 3rd year. MVS, I feel like they like that he brings something that those other guys don't. He's a field stretcher. He's a tall, big body guy. Say what you want about his inconsistency. He's got guaranteed money. And then Mac Hollins, they love what he offers in special teams. So this would have to be a guy that would be a great value, and he would absolutely have to be something that you just can't live without to make it happen, if that makes sense. Like, you can't bring in a guy who's going to be fighting to be a number 5. Like, I don't see why you would do that. So, but it'll be interesting to see. Again, Brandon Beane has done things like this in the past, where he's brought somebody in just for competition, just to have iron sharpen iron and stuff like that. So, but it'll be really interesting to see how he feels about how this roster's set going forward.
Kevin, I know we talk about receiver all the time and acquiring a receiver. Are you set on this offensive side of the ball? It's 23-27 right now in terms of offensive defensive players. It's in a complete lopsided. Like I said on our last roster prediction, I thought 24-26, although it's marginal, it's still heavily weighted defense by 4 players. And I think that obviously the practice squad has to reflect offensive players. I'll get into my opinion on who that'll look like. But are you thinking that I just think there's too few weapons? I'm not saying that you need to go and add 2 or 3 offensive players to this offense. They won't get the ball. But what are your opinions I'm okay with 5 to the point Dave made about just getting players who have to come in and learn the offense and do nothing when you already have a couple of receivers like Shavers and KJ Hamler that are probably going to be on the practice squad. What are your opinions on maybe Marshall? Probably not going to get to the Bills. But then you have guys like Noah Brown, got a couple of other interesting names out there. Still could make a lower end deal for John Mechie. And one position we didn't talk about yet here, quarterback. Are we like, I don't know. He was in a big bulky knee brace. And according to Banged Up Bills, Dr. Kyle Trimble thought he could even go on IR. So like, maybe it's not 4 weeks, maybe it's 2, but now we're putting Ben DiNucci on the practice squad and elevating him for 2 weks. That's scary to me. Did the Bills go call Cleveland, who kept 4 quarterbacks? Do you see that? They kept 4 quarterbacks, 2 running backs. Their roster development was absolutely wild. It was like Jerome Ford, and then like they didn't keep like many other skill players. It was super weird. But they have to trade one of those guys, whether it's Huntley or even Jameis Winston. They were saying to shop, where a guy that I think does match Josh Allen's skill set. He really does. But Kevin, what are your opinions? Quarterback, you thinking nothing? You thinking there is room for that receiver? I just think that there's going to ultimately be a defensive player that they can steal from if they need to add a offensive player.
Yeah, I think there has to be something coming, if not more. And we'll get to the defense in a minute here, and we'll see maybe some positions or some individual players that they can shed from. But to my point, when I previously answered your other question, let's just say we get to week 1. Mitch Trubisky's knee is worse than originally intended. He can't go. Curtis Samuel's turf toe hasn't healed. MVS's neck strain hasn't healed. Quentin Morris's shoulder is not where it's supposed to be. You're rolling with Josh Allen as your quarterback. You have 3 healthy wide receivers and 2 healthy tight ends. That's it. 5 pass catchers. Say what you want about the running backs. I'm concerned. And again, we're 12 days outside of September 8th, week 1 kickoff, but I wanted to feel a little bit more encouraged after 4 o'clock. Like, I don't think we mentioned him yet. Joe Andreessen, he made the 53-man roster. I love that. That's a great story. I was feeling really good when the news came out. I think it was like 3:30, maybe 4 o'clock. But I was like, all right, here we go. And then I saw the cuts, and I'm like, wait a sec. The defense is cool now, but what are we doing at backup quarterback? What are we doing at wide receiver? What are we doing at tight end? So it's just kind of hard to say right now.
I think tight end's only a concern because we need another guy there, and we like Zach Davidson. Like there's like, I'm not the biggest Quentin Morris fan. I'll never be. Like I like his like story of being a converted receiver to tight end to have a little bit of pass catching chops. I think he's quite frankly redundant with the Dalton Kincaid, and I just don't overly see the need. But however, the Bills will feel like there's no way that the Bills know that Morris, Samuel, and MVS won't be. There's just no way. It doesn't make any sense. No one would ever roster develop like that. They have to feel pretty good about 2, if not all 3 of them being back week 1. A week, it was not quite a week ago now, where Sean McDermott has mentioned all of them being ready, and he's really conservative with giving us anything. I think the only time he was ever really wrong with Vaughn a little bit, and that was just a weird scenario. Maybe a little bit with Trey when he was kind of sitting out with that first injury. But overall, he's never giving us anything to be like totally like, he'll say, not sure yet. We're hoping for the best. But the fact that he said, no, we're expecting them to be available week 1, the Bills got out of it fairly healthy. They almost made it through pretty healthy for the most part, minus a tackling dummy injury to Matt Milano, which is just totally unfortunate and just wild. But the good news also, we'll talk about defense in a minute, with Darrington Evans coming back designated for, so is Matt Milano. So the Bills feel pretty strongly. And Dr. David Chow said himself, could be more late November than December. So maybe we're going to get him back in full strength. At that stage, the Bills will know what they have in Dorian Williams. Is Dorian Williams playing top notch? Is he just okay? Does he need to be replaced? Is someone else already replaced him at that point? There's so many varying levels for when Matt Milano does come back. And it's not going to be a knee injury or an Achilles or bad foot. It's going to be, his arm, where it should be healed by that point and shouldn't really affect anything. So it's going to be completely different. And then that leg gets a little bit longer to heal. It's going to be completely different than if, say, he had just tore his meniscus last April. It's going to be a scenario where, it's going to be an arm injury. So that's going to be some pretty good news and notes to follow, Dave. So are you feeling, kind of wrap up this offense for us? You seem pretty okay with it, minus like KJ Hamler going to the practice squad. And you seem to be like the issue I have is like you're already going to most likely need to use one of your 2 elevations on quarterback, most likely at least for a week.
Yeah.
Thus leaving only one more player. You're not going to call up anyone on defense. You're heavy there. So in theory, you could call up a receiver, and maybe it is KJ Hamler. Is that kind of where you're going to leave it here for the offense?
Yeah, I think, but let me ask you guys a question. I want to ask you guys a question.
Sure.
How do you guys feel about Reggie Gilliam? Do you think that he warrants a roster spot every year? And it's no hate on Reggie Gilliam, because there's a lot of times when I absolutely forget about Reggie Gilliam until he makes a big special teams hit. And it's like, okay, there's Reggie Gilliam. All right. So that's what it is. But unless there's going to be a plan to incorporate him somehow at the fullback position, not the tight end version of Reggie Gilliam, the fullback version of Reggie Gilliam, this spot could have gone to, like Kevin Syracuse was talking about, another skill set player that is going to need to be used. Take away the injury stuff that we were just talking about and being concerned if they're going to be ready or not. But having another player on the offensive side of the ball, which you could have used it for, as we could have kept Zach Davidson, we could have kept a 6th wide receiver, a 4th running back, what have you. How do you guys feel about Reggie Gilliam? And every year he seems to just make his way back onto this roster year after year. What do you guys think?
I think he's one. Not only he's a smart cut because of what the cap savings that you would have around $1.7 million. You could have paid for his replacement and another player. You could have paid for Davidson. Like ultimately, they have to have envisions. Like, we're not counting him in the offense. Kevin didn't even use him in his breakdown when he was talking about available weapons. He would technically be an available weapon and can do different things in different personnel packages. It's funny that, like, a lot of people think the best of Quentin Morris. But then, like, you look at Reggie Gilliam, like, he definitely is a guy you could incorporate in the offense, and maybe with Joe Brady will have more use for him offensively than Ken Dorsey did. We were starting to see a little bit with Brian Dable. So I think ultimately he's too expensive on top of it. Look, if he's one of their core special teamers, because they've gotten rid of Saran Neal, they've gotten rid of Tyler Matakevich, like, at some point, I guess they need to have special teamers. You can't just roll all rookies. I am in the camp of rolling out all rookies and backups because the unit stinks anyways. But at some point, they're going to need to go with Reggie Gilliam. Kevin, I mean, I know you probably agree, but you're someone that's like, nah, he needs to be rostered at any expense.
I mean, I do like Reggie Gilliam. I like that they can use him for blocking, for running, for pass catching, and special teams, and that's huge. And the Bills love that versatility. But I mean, to your guys' points, it kind of seems redundant after a while, where it's like, okay, can we just keep Zach Davidson or maybe a 6 wide receiver? Because is Gilliam actually going to see the field in a meaningful way? Like, does he actually appear on the stat sheet? And actually, I think there was a stat last year. I think this was a Ken Dorsey stat, that the Bills' offense was better when Reggie Gilliam was on the field. So I think he is valuable, but it's just kind of hard when you're looking at it from like a box score perspective, and it's like, well, what does this guy really do? Like, can't we just get someone else to fill that role and then some?
Yeah, the silly perspective with Reggie Gilliam is like, that's what his defenders will say. They'll pull some obscure metrics like, oh, someone once said that the Bills' offense is better. Yeah, in limited sample size. They probably ran the ball really well. He's in the game late when they're dominating, probably. So there's a lot that goes into that EPA per play, and a lot that goes into when he's on the field is probably plus situations for him. He's not in the game in tough situations or when the going is tough on the offense. He's in the game when it's very plus scenarios or early on and early downs or things where that I guess that's useful, but I think it's kind of fool's gold that if you were to assume to roll in Reggie Gilliam into your offense in an uptick of 25 to 30% or something, like at some point that little bump he had down in the 10% snap number is going to take a huge regression at some percentage increase. And I don't really want to toy with that. I don't really think we need to find out what that number needs to be. I'm assuming, Dave, you asked a question, but you probably agree that there's probably no real
I think in all the years that we don't need a Reggie Gilliam, and again, this is not me hating on Reggie Gilliam. I understand his value. I understand what he's meant to this team, and he's been here for a while. But in all the years and this is to both of your points earlier about what's this offense going to look like. We really still don't even know that. So again, he may be some sort of a focal point, at least as a blocker or something, to where they want to use him so they see the value. But you would think of all the years with the turnover that the Bills have had, especially on the offensive side of the ball, skill position players, that this would be a year that they would look to, okay, maybe we don't need a Reggie Gilliam, but maybe we need a fourth tight end, to your guys' point. Or maybe we do need a fourth back because we're going to run the ball more and we want some different looks. Or we want just a straight return guy, which would have freed up another position because we made a trade for a guy who's a DB. So I don't know. I think just out of all the years where you're in this sort of transitional period, and they have gotten rid of the guys like Tyler Medikevich and Saron Niels and stuff like that, to where they were just special teams guys. So we'll see. I mean, I mean, all the purists will probably see this and hate that because they'll bring up the EPA and they'll bring up all this stuff and all these different, the metrics for when he's on the field. That's fine. But when it's 6 snaps or 8 snaps out of a game of 75 offensive snaps or whatever it is, he's not really doing anything to move the needle. And if you could get a guy like Zach Davidson, who may walk and get picked up, who you had in the building that you could develop, I think that it would be beneficial for us to just bring in more skill position players that can actually, contribute to the offense in a year where you're entering sort of this unknown. Because I've said since day one of Joe Brady completely getting full reins of this offense, it's going to be trial by error a lot. I think we're going to start the season with, okay, what's really working, what's not. And there's going to be some frustrating times because they got to work the kinks out, right? They lost Mitch Morse. They have a new left guard. They have a whole bunch of new skill position players. So I don't know. That's just my opinion. Again, no hate on Reggie Gilliam. I know he does bring value to the team, but I just thought that this might be the year where they move in a different direction.
And look, he's at 100. What was it? 100. Let me pull my data. 107 snaps last year, 24 receiving, 10 pass blocking, 73 run blocking. Was a really good run blocker. So his EPA is going to be obviously really increased when he has a good performance. I'm assuming he played plenty and good wins. Week 15. I'm assuming that was the Dallas game. Week 14 and week 15 really were his plethora of snaps, really were phased out of the offense by week 5. From week 5 to week 10, really didn't play. Was phased out early on in that in that Dorsey offense. And then, you found the stroke a little bit week 14 and week 15. And then even Brady himself played him 4 snaps a game. So at some point, like, he had a little bit of a boost in some of those games. But ultimately, he is a special teamer. The Bills paid him. They probably said, maybe one more year. But I think this may be it for Reggie Gilliam. This is the end of the line. This is probably the last roster that he'll be on. But I agree. The roster spot, the money savings, there are a bunch of things there that the Bills could have done. And most notably getting Josh another weapon, at least someone that could help. But similar, like we're talking about KJ Hamler, maybe the Bills do feel okay that Zach Davidson will go to practice squad and be able to be called up. Or if not, they like what they saw blocking from Trey McKitty and did show a little bit of juice in the preseason. And if Davidson's claimed, they're just like, well, we got McKitty, whatever. Like, we're not ultimately that mad. And I would imagine that's the mindset. We'd rather have a core guy, special teamer, probably going to be a captain. That's the other problem, I would assume, especially with the captain turnover. So ultimately, Brandon Beane was like, yeah, we could save a little bit of money, but this is the move that we're gonna continue to pound. But the quarterback room is still super interesting to me. I just don't think that they have a roster spot they can use at quarterback. And we're going to have to roll Trubisky and call up Danucci for a couple of weeks, most likely, and use one of your call-ups. As much as I would say Huntley's probably better, and as much as I would probably say like someone like Jameis Winston would be a nice insurance policy, I just ultimately don't think Beane's going to use that and then use a roster spot. We can't even find one for some of our tight ends and receivers. I certainly don't think they're going to figure out a way to utilize a roster spot. But what they could do, though, is now that he made the original 53, Kevin, Trubisky's not out of the woods on going. You didn't have to get put on IR today. That wasn't a rule. The Bills just had 2 free spots to use before cuts, so they didn't have to do the parking lot moves. But what the Bills could do tomorrow is put him on the injured reserve and then bring him back as well, like they will with Darrington Evans and with Matt Milano. So you didn't have to be designated today. That was just the free spots you could use, the 2 frees. Anybody else could go to IR, including Quentin Morris, including anybody else on the roster. They wanted them to make the original 53 first, and then you have the capabilities to come back on designated for a return. So none of that is out of the woods yet. We're assuming Trubisky's okay. We're assuming Quentin Morris is okay, and MVS and Curtis Samuel, we sure hope are okay. But any of them or all of them, in theory, could be utilized. You sign a guy and you're like, sorry, Trubisky, you're going on IR for 4 games. Like, sorry. It could happen just that quick. Same with Quentin Morris. We got to bring up Zach Davidson or whatever the case may be. You're out, dude. So that's ultimately, Kevin, that would be the battle. So if Quentin Morris comes back next week and he's hurt, that they're going to put him on IR. So I don't think there's ever going to be a situation to that being all the only weapons that Josh has on his disposal. And we also don't know who had an arrangement. Maybe KJ Hamler, Dave, had an arrangement that when we put one more player on IR, one of these guys is a 4-week injury. Maybe it is Hamler that gets the beneficiary of that at all. So I think that's all things to remember. This isn't a set roster, even on the injured reserve front. This is just a really solid skeleton initial, for the most part, main roster. But those last 2 spots and IR stuff, that's going to get fluctuated in 3rd January. Right, Dave?
Yeah, I think so. I just making the trade for, a returner also didn't bode well for KJ Hamler.
No.
Because I think a lot of us thought throughout camp that it was between Daquan Hardy, Andy Isabella, and KJ Hamler for the return spot. But then they went and made the trade with the Jets. Now they brought in a returner who obviously is going to make the roster. And then that was post KJ Hamler being released. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting. I don't know if they want 6 wide receivers. I want 6. That's just me, because I think you get a lot more versatility. Bring in somebody that gives you a skill set that you don't have in one of the other guys. But we'll see. It'll be pretty interesting.
Yeah, we talked a lot about the offense. Kevin, any final thoughts you had on the offense as we try to transition away and talk about the defense for a minute here, or have you gotten out everything that you're feeling?
Well, I saw a lot of people in the comments who were talking about Frank Gore Jr. And, I love that guy, but I just didn't see a path for him to make the roster, just because, when we went through last week and in previous weeks just trying to find roster spots, it's so hard to try to keep 4 running backs and Reggie Gilliam. And I know that they kept Darrington Evans, but that's with the IR stash. So really, him being hurt might have helped him make this team, because they could kind of stash him on IR and say, okay, well, when we bring you back, we'll worry about the repercussions after that, So I'm sad that Frank Gore didn't make this team, but at the same time, I'm not surprised. I think he'll definitely get claimed because he put in a great preseason. He had a great summer, great training camp. So I would be shocked if he finds his way back onto the practice squad. But to someone's question earlier, can the Bills put him on the practice squad? Yeah, he'd be a perfect candidate. I just don't know if he'll get there.
And he's one play away from being on the roster too. So it does behoove him to be in this offense where he looked good under a good offense, good run blocking right now. It doesn't behoove him to choose somewhere else, especially your other competitor, Evans, is on IR. It doesn't take Ty Johnson's been hurt for the last few years. There's something that, bangs him up by the biceps injury. He got hurt early on with the hamstring this year. So it's definitely there for him for the taking, but if he's claimed, he's claimed. But a lot of people ultimately went with their own running backs. Cleveland has 2 of them right now. That's a little interesting, but for the most part, everybody has their 3 favorite running backs. And then, they have a guy themselves that they're trying to get through. Like, is he Abanikanda? Everybody has the guy that they like on their roster, whomever it may be. And most people are going to most likely keep their own rather than try to claim someone else and waive somebody. It doesn't make an over amount of sense. Obviously, probably anyone would want Frank Gore. Frank Gore will probably have his choice of practice squad. That's probably true. But ultimately, I do think that he'll come back here. And it's interesting that he had an injury that game too, but they chose to IR Darrington Evans. I don't think they could have IR Frank Gore. That was my last minute prediction. So maybe Frank Gore was like, when I'm healthy, I'll take a practice squad. So I don't know. There's something there too when it comes to the running back, because the Bills probably were like, well, IR one of them. We don't care. And ultimately they chose Evans. I don't ultimately think either their injuries were probably longer than a few weeks at most. So maybe Gore said, I'm healthy. Put me on your roster. We'll see what happens over the next couple of days. But we want to talk about the defense now. Thank you to our show sponsors. We got the Summit Center. We got Larson-Timko and Dave Dengler. Please smash the like button. We have 600 live listeners, so we really appreciate everybody Appreciate everybody tuning in here. Evans had a hamstring. He did, but Gore had the knee. So ultimately, I don't know if any of them were overly bad, but it remains to be seen what we hear from them when they speak here shortly. But yeah, please smash the like button, and also presented as corporate sponsor, shout out to Monster Energy as well. So we really appreciate everything that's going on here on the network. We got a ton of content coming at you this week, all week long. We're just the starting point. We got shows coming out Thursday and Friday and Saturday and Sunday. So there's so much content coming out the network. So feel free to tune into our YouTube and smash the subscribe button there as well. But we got to talk about the defense. We got to put a little bit of time in here. We talked about it, pre-talked about it. But we got to put a little bit of time in on the defense as we approach the top of the hour. And then I got it. I know you guys are really just trying to derail me from my practice squad, but we're going to get to the practice squad and everybody else's opinion toward the middle to the end of the show here. But we're going to look at this, Kevin, as we look through the defense. And obviously the thing we're going to talk about is the swapping of the backup nickel / returner. We have spent some time on that, but outside of the Daquan Hardy situation, obviously Casey Tuhill's another one that sticks out to us, but more importantly, going heavy at the end, going heavy at linebacker. I think that Chiefs game scared the heck out of him, didn't it?
Yeah, I think it did. And I'm really surprised to see Tuhill get the nod over Kingsley Jonathan, because Tuhill has been dealing with injuries, or maybe just one injury, but like he hasn't been on the field much this summer. And Kingsley Jonathan has really impressed me, and I think he's impressed others. And I was at that Steelers game in Pittsburgh, and he made some nice plays, not only on defense, but on special teams as well. And to my knowledge, I'm not sure if Tuhill gives them that opportunity or ability on special teams. So I figured they would keep Kingsley over Casey Tuhill, but nonetheless, they went with Tuhill.
Yeah, it's an interesting decision. Dave, follow him up for me. I know, Codrington aside, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I too like the Casey Tuhill over Kingsley Jonathan was concerning. Kingsley Jonathan's been in the system, right? So he knows what McDermott wants, and he performs when he's called upon. He, in the small doses we've seen him get meaningful snaps, I don't think he's been in a position where he's not done a service for this team. Like I feel like he's gotten what the Bills want out of their sixth edge defender. And Casey Tuhill, like Hughes was talking about, like we haven't seen him. We don't even know. We know what he did last year when he was with the Commanders. I'm not sure if this is a contract type deal. And then good old Cam Lewis just finds a way to make this roster. You talk about a guy that they really value. I talked about him in the spring a lot when we didn't have any safeties under contract, except minus DeMar Hamlin, of course. He just finds a way on this roster. He took a spot away from somebody else. You talk about Daquan Hardy, who, yes, he's a corner, and Cam Lewis is a safety, but he can also do, the backup nickel role. We've seen him do that before. We've seen him play corner. But other than that, I think they got it right. I'm a little concerned for Buffalo Joe when Matt Milano comes back. What's the roster going to look like when that happens? And obviously we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But Balen Spector survived again. And I don't know about you guys, and we kind of talked about it a little bit before we came on live, but I haven't been overwhelmed with Balen Spector. He played a little bit last year, very serviceable for your fifth or sixth linebacker. But when you have Dorian Williams, who you want to progress into this guy that can be maybe an heir apparent to when Matt Milano's not here anymore, or you need in a pinch like now, or when a Terrell Bernard goes down, something like that. You brought in a Nicholas Moreau. You drafted Olafoshio. Like, I don't know. I don't. And again, this is where they could have maybe added a fifth defensive tackle or a sixth wide receiver or a fifth corner or something, the roster gymnastics. But overall, I think it's a really deep defensive line. I do like the fact that there's three guys, I think, at defensive tackle that can start. I do love Dwayne Carter. I feel like he'll get some meaningful snaps as the season progresses. Austin Johnson, yes, very serviceable backup. But I think we're going to see big things from Greg Rousseau, and I think we're going to see stuff from Von Miller that maybe not a lot of people are going to be ready to see. I think we're going to get Von Miller of 2 years ago. I really do. I like what I've seen from training camp. Obviously, we haven't seen him at all play in preseason, but he looks like he's very bendy again, and he looks like he's getting very agile again. So I think that they got it right. I honestly think that they got it right, minus maybe, not having Daquan Hardy on here. But other than that, I think they got it right.
Okay. I think that's a thorough breakdown. And I think the thing about Casey Toohill is that he has produced at a decent level here. He was handpicked by this regime. Like I think we all kind of slept on him. The injury happened through preseason and we're like, yeah, he's done. I would have had him on my roster prediction had he, and this is stupid, had he played a little bit more in preseason. It shouldn't really matter. He had 7 career sacks. He had 5 last year. He's pretty effective all around. And he did enough, 6'5", 254. He did enough to show that his energy and what he's able to do. He has been effective, especially in a rotational defensive end role. And they just ultimately felt with keeping someone like Javon Solomon alongside of him that ultimately, he would be the guy they go with. If he's on the roster, he would qualify to be a vested veteran and to get his guaranteed money. I don't see the Bills ever moving on from him. At the end of the day, it's not the world's largest thing to cut Casey Toohill. But I think if it was to be cut, it would be in the next. I don't know what the date is of being on the roster, maybe next Wednesday. But if it's next Wednesday, he does get his guaranteed contract. So if they're going to move on from him, it's going to be in the next week. I don't think it's like one of those week 5 things. You have to pay him his whole salary and that eats up your cap. That's just money you could have rolled over just to put in Kingsley Jonathan. I don't see that. If Casey Toohill was their option, they put him on their roster and whatever. That's their. I don't have too much care about that because I would have put him on my roster. I do think when he was signed, he was replacing Shaq Lawson. So ultimately, with Smoot being able to jump inside, Casey Toohill may get more rotational snaps than we think. And I don't think we'll see Javon Solomon yet. I think he'll be healthy and active on game days going forward. So Casey Toohill will probably be the 4th defensive end. Smoot will jump inside, pretty frequently. So I think you'll see that 9-man rotation. And then also Toohill himself could be inactive if they need to pull anybody else from another position. But linebacker, you look through that. Olafosio was always talked about highly, a guy we haven't talked about much here. It just felt like they were absolutely going to roster him. It was never really in question. Both McDermott and Bobby Babbage Jr. love Olafosio, so I was never feeling like he would be out of off the roster. And then they went heavy at linebacker. Like Spector was successful at times post Milano injury, but he keeps getting hurt. It would have been nice to even see him in the playoffs because he could have been helpful potentially against that Chiefs passing attack. And Joe Andreessen made the roster, but until he's on the roster like week 2, I'll never feel like he's on the roster. And then even when Matt Milano comes back, I won't feel like he's on the roster. So he's always going to have an uphill battle, especially with them being so heavy on defense and then needing to make potential moves if they do acquire one of those weapons that we talked about on the offensive side of the show. He's got to be. It could be Spector, but he's got to be the first one out right now. If you change it more to 24 and 26 on the breakouts from offense to defense. Because right now it's extremely lopsided. And they like something they saw from Codrington. Ultimately, they thought he would be a better returner. The Bills give up a slight asset. But if he stinks and they want Hardy back and Hardy's still in on their practice squad, they can just waive Codrington. It was a 30-round pick swap next in 2026 in 2 drafts late in the draft. Ultimately, they didn't give up anything for him, and he doesn't cost anything. So they can just move on from him if they'd like to go back to Hardy for whatever reason. And then my sleeper is still Mike Edwards to start on this roster. DeMar Hamlin was hurt himself. I think that week 1 rolls around and you're going to see Taylor Rapp and Mike Edwards starting at safety with Benford, Rasul Douglas, and Taron Johnson to make up a pretty solid secondary unit. And then Bernard and then Dorian Williams is still, at this point going to be the starter unless they really want to plug in Nicholas Morrow at week. But that's going to be the biggest difference here at this defense. But fairly straightforward outside of rostering Casey Toohill, which doesn't really matter. And then swapping out Hardy for Codrington. Everything else, and then you got Cam Lewis, $1.4 million special teamer. Was healthy all offseason. Most people don't remember he signed a 2-year deal, most likely to be on this roster regardless. He was going to be here. And he plays every nickel. He plays, backup safety, and then the special teams ability. He's just actually a more useful Reggie Gilliam. We had that Reggie Gilliam sentiment. Plays a little bit better, more defensively than Reggie Gilliam does on offense. And Dave, that's what we have to look forward to. But anything you wanted to note on defense? Any final thoughts? It still looks like a pretty good unit that held, a bad Pittsburgh preseason team to 3 points.
Cuse, I know you want to go too. The only thing that I want to, if you look at this, it screams youth, right? If you look at this, the depth screams youth, which we obviously know we're in this huge youth movement. I mean, you got Epinesa, you got Dwayne Carter. Can you put that back up real quick?
Oh, sure.
That's okay. You got Epinesa, you got Dwayne Carter, you got Solomon, Ulofoshio, Joe Andreessen, Kyrie Elam, Christian Benford, Cole Bishop, like Greg Rousseau. This screams youth movement, and I love it. And again, we may have some bumps here, but one thing about Coach McDermott is he always gets these guys, whether it's this group, the group we had last year, year before, he always gets these guys ready for the season. And I will say one thing too. If you guys remember 2017, the Bills' offensive group was not great, right? We had Tyrod Taylor throwing to Charles Clay and a bunch of other guys. The defense is what got that team to the playoffs. So now just imagine you have Josh Allen, you got some better skill position players. And I don't know why that just popped in my head, but it did. Random thought of the day, I guess. But I love the youth on our defensive depth chart. I think that's the biggest thing that stands out to me.
There you go. Kevin, bring us home. What do you think about defense? Give us your final thoughts. You still think it's going to be successful and be that team that everybody knows it can be, holding the, a preseason Steelers offense who is going all out for 3 points? Is that still your expectation, or is that Milano injury, just looking at the roster, is it going to be too much for him?
No, I think they'll be okay, especially considering that Milano can come back this year, because I would rather have it be the way we have it this year, where Milano gets injured first and then he can come back, rather than he plays, everything's going great, and then he suffers a season-ending injury. So I'm not too concerned with that. The one point that I wanted to make, though, was Dave talked about this. Balen Spector is definitely the outlier here for me, outside of Casey Toohill, because the best ability is availability, and Balen Spector seems to let us down. And I know you can't control getting hurt, but some guys are just more apt to getting hurt than others. And when we needed Balen Spector to step up in the playoffs last year, he was not available. So we had to call A.J. Klein to come out of his RV in Florida to come up to Buffalo and cover Travis Kelce. So I think the Bills are kind of shell-shocked by that, and they want to prevent that from happening again. So you want to build up that depth. But when you look at the offensive perspective like we did, you could have just said, Balen Spector, I'm sorry, but you're not there for us, so we're going to try to get you back on the practice squad. But we like the depth that we built up here between Nicholas Morrow, Edifon Ulofoshio, and Joe Andreessen. And we would like to have Matt Milano come back as well. So we're going to save this roster spot for a 6 wide receiver, or Zach Davidson, or even Lyle Collins, or Will Clapp. So I think Balen Spector is the outlier here for me, when I think that was almost redundant. And now you're looking at an offense that won't be as, what's the word I'm looking for here? The offense is a little bit more concerning, I guess. I don't want to raise the alarm and say, oh, it's panic mode time, but I just think that the offense is a little bit lackluster right now with only 23 players and not as many weapons for Josh Allen.
I don't believe Hardy's hurt. So he would have had to have been in having an injury settlement, would have had to at least start on IR and then be released from IR. So I don't believe, to any of the reports, that he was hurt, at least anything longer than very, very minor. Is probably untrue. So I'm not sure where the hurt report came from. But he is not hurt according to his waiver status. So we'll see how that turns out. And we got some agreements. Spector should have been cut. I mean, he's never available, even if he shows stuff. I mean, he clearly does. Like, when he is in and healthy, he does. I'm like, okay, I see Spector. Like, he's held, pretty good defensive lines or defensive captain spots on a good college team. So, like, I see the potential there from Spector, but it's never going to happen. Casey Middlestat scenario, not exactly who would be a Casey Middle. I guess I don't know the Casey Middlestat scenario that was going on there, but it's the time to talk about the practice squad. It's one of my favorite times to go. Some people hate it, some people love it, some people don't care. I'm definitely someone that loves to talk about it. But before I do, Kevin, anything that you care to see how this practice squad's developed? Do you just want equal balance? Do you want a heavy offense? Load up on receivers, weapons? Like what on a by and large, what's your thought on what the Bills should do here, knowing they're pretty light on the offensive side of the ball?
Well, remind me and our viewers again of like how many spots the Bills and other NFL teams have. So like how many spots do they have? And I think they have a certain amount of veterans that they can keep as well, right?
It's 16 spots. Only 6 of them can be 3 years or greater. As vet status for the practice squad is actually a year quicker than total vet status. So that's super weird. Don't know why I wouldn't just follow the same universal vet rules, but vet practice squad status is guys 3 years of accrued seasons and up. How they determine an accrued season is you need to play a certain amount of games in a season to have an accruement of seasons. So 3 experience level or above is a vet status, and those guys actually make between $15,000 and $20,000 a week on the practice squad. Not like costly in dollars and cents for a major sports team, but is costly to your cap as you utilize those veteran spots, especially at $20,000. You have to account for every dime of it on your cap, times it by 6. It does take a little chunk out from your total available cap space. So that's how you develop a practice squad, and the rules have been better since COVID there. 6 vet spots, 16 total spots, 2 elevations, 3 times each. I mean, it's decent. I mean, it can still, there's still some things that they can work on, but that's generally the rules of the practice squad.
Okay. So, I mean, there are a ton of players that I would love to get back on the practice squad between Frank Gore Jr., Zach Davidson, Terrell Shavers, KJ Hamler, even La'el Collins and or Will Clapp. But I just don't see all these guys clearing waivers. And to your point with the veteran status, you don't have to do it like with Collins and Clapp. You can just get them back and designate them as like those veterans. But to our points earlier, it's going to be tough to get Frank Gore Jr. and Zach Davidson back here. And that's why it's so tough to get rid of these guys. Even Terrell Shavers, who was really coming on. Justin Shorter, too. He was coming on a little bit late. So these are all guys that it's like, okay, well, they didn't make the 53. Let's just put them on the practice squad. Well, you have a bunch of other teams who probably are lining up saying, hey, the Bills are a perennial Super Bowl contender. And if they release X, Y, and Z players, let's go after them because Brandon Beane knows what he's doing when he's constructing a roster. So that's why you have to be very careful when you construct your own roster because you have other teams just waiting to pluck off of our roster.
There you have it. Dave, your thoughts? Anything on the practice squad for you? Anything you like to see? Anything you care about, if at all? Where do you stand on developing your practice squad?
I think it depends on who lands on there, right? Like you want to see a Daquan Hardy get developed because he was a draft pick.
Hardy. I didn't even mention him.
Yeah, you want to see Zach Davidson if he makes it develop because he looks like he's a promising young player. That's my biggest thing is just put guys on there that you don't just want to stash, but you actually want to develop and actually like a Jamarcus Ingram, right? Like guys that you want to actually make the roster. Because other than that, I mean, we're using it for like, Leonard Fournette and stuff like that, guys that never play and things like that. So as long as it's constructed, and I trust Beane will do the right thing and they'll construct it the way that we think they will, though obviously we need a quarterback on there. Some skill position players would be nice from the young guys like Shavers and things like that. But other than that, yeah, I don't overly think too much about the practice squad, other than when we find out who's getting called up on game weeks. So I trust them to make the right decision and just develop the young guys the best way that you can. And hopefully those guys can make the rosters because again, you spent a draft pick on Daquan Hardy. You want to see if he makes it to the practice squad first. And secondly, can we develop him, get him back on the team at some point?
Makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning Hardy because he was at the top of my list, but like there were so many other names circulating around, I somehow left him off. But yeah, those are probably my top 3: Hardy, Gore, and Davidson. But I think if those are my top 3, don't think that teams like the Patriots, the Jets, the Dolphins, in division teams, they're just waiting. Like Zach Davidson seems like a perfect Patriot type of player,
especially with Brady. Yeah, for sure. But if you look at, here's Kevin's practice squad. Here's the names that I put together that could make sense. The Bills will not go 16 all Bills players. I put 4 vets on here. They could go with 6, but I'm going to go with 4. And they're definitely going to have 3 2 to 5 new players here, but I just made it as if I can't predict at all who they would sign from other teams that would choose to come to Buffalo over signing with their own teams. Because if Buffalo wants them on their practice squad, that means their own team probably wants them. So I can't really predict what those players would look like. I don't think anyone could. But here's what I got. I mean, I got Ben DiNucci, Frank Gore Jr., pretty much everything we talked about summed up in this in the show. Shavers, KJ Hamler as a vet. Justin Shorter. So those 3 receivers right there. The Bills could certainly pick only 2 of those and go out of the go off their roster for the 3rd receiver if they'd like. Zach Davidson and Trey McKitty. I thought both of them did enough to be, priorities here on their practice squad. Will Clapp was my veteran interior offensive lineman with Keaton Bills, Richard Garage. So really only 3 offensive linemen here just because they're 9 on the active roster as it is. But as you continue to look down to Deshaun Williams, I think they'll try to get back on here. They did say they liked Eli Ankou as well. So Eli Ankou could be in here for either Stevenson or Deshaun Williams. And he would qualify as a vet as well. So it's either going to be Williams, Stevenson, and with only 4 defensive tackles, I think they'll go 2 on the practice squad. Only Kingsley Jonathan I have back because they're heavy on defensive end. No linebackers currently need to go on the practice squad. They have 6 and Milano on IR. I don't think there's need at all for a practice squad linebacker, but one off the team could happen somewhere else that they just bring in. That's certainly very possible. And then the 3 DBs that I really like, Corey Couch, I thought is absolutely right here in the conversation to be on the practice squad. Daquan Hardy, we've all talked about Hardy enough to be developed. And then Kareem Jackson, just in case those injuries pop up back up, and he's been in the defense now. I think that they'll utilize him as a veteran safety presence on the practice squad. They're heavy in the DB market too. So really only 3 practice squad DBs, no linebackers, and a few defensive linemen. So I went heavier on the offensive side. Dave and Kevin, what do you guys, something like this make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes great sense, but honestly, half of those players could get claimed or just sign with other teams. So if this is a practice squad, as it turns out to be, I'd be very happy and encouraged, and I would feel a little bit better. And again, the needle shouldn't move that much on cutdown day, but my concern comes from we have some big questions to answer over these next 12 days.
Sure do. Yeah. Dave, any final thoughts on practice squads?
No, not on practice squads. Really, I'm just thinking you never know the next 4, 5, 6 days who's going to be released from a roster for whatever reason. Yes, they are 53 right now across the board, but things are going to happen. I mean, you remember when we signed Jordan Phillips, it was a week before the season started. That was never in the plans. So they had to do some gymnastics there. And I think that there's going to be a couple things that'll happen. I don't know if it'll be something spectacular, but I think there's going to be a couple guys that are going to be added. A couple guys are going to be subtracted. And obviously when they, put together their practice squad, then we'll see, what their main focus is here. And just one quick thing too, looking at the offense versus defense on, the depth charts. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we forget that we have a very defensive-minded head coach who is very stingy with how he likes to run his defense with his rotations and his DBs and things like that. I think that will always be a lopsided roster when it comes to how the Bills construct that because of the depth at defensive tackle, the depth at defensive end. Obviously, Brandon Beane focusing and making it a point to have more linebackers on the roster this year because we need depth. And it always, like Kevin said earlier, we always seem to be, in this aspect, chasing the Chiefs, right? So they looked at that Chiefs game and said, okay, we had no depth. We still almost won. Imagine if we have depth, not just there, but in other spots too on defense. So I think that's why, the defense, there's more linebackers, there's more body count than there is on offense just because we have a defensive minded head coach and he knows what he likes to do there, which could be fluid. Offensively, they may need more guys offensively, skill position players in the future based off of how successful they are or not successful they are. But again, trial and error with Joe Brady and his new system. So I just want to throw that out.
No, I'm glad you did because that Chiefs point is like case in point here with what the Bills are doing. And I love Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane, so I don't mean to harp on them too much because I trust them more than I trust myself. But we've seen for years that they're trying to chase Kansas City. And I get that to a point. But you can't just get so specific and say, oh, well, we didn't have the depth at linebacker last year, so now we need to do everything that we can to make sure that that doesn't happen again. You need to do that to a point, but then you can't suffer at other positions because you're so worried about going down a linebacker that now you're going to be lackluster at, let's just say, wide receiver, offensive line, tight end, even backup quarterback. So I think sometimes they just need to broaden their spectrum a little bit and say, let's build up the linebacker room while not forgetting about the pass catchers and the weapons for Josh.
Yeah, how many backers did they roster last year? Was it 4 or 5?
I think
For
5,
most of the
right?
season, it was 5, right? So there's an extra one there, obviously. So yeah, so that, and you have to. People forget like the linebackers weren't competing against linebackers; they were competing against a 6th wide receiver, a 4th running back, a 4th tight end, a 10th offensive lineman, things like that. So it's interesting. Yeah, that's one. I didn't pick 6 linebackers. I thought for because it would have been interesting if Milano didn't get injured. Which one of those guys is Balen Spector on the roster? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like Joe Andreessen's probably not on the roster. So it's interesting how that benefited how they built the roster based off of one injury. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and they had 5 last year, and one of them was Matakevich, who can't play linebacker. So
Right. He can't play linebacker.
That was an interesting decision that they made. So right around October, the roster last year was Milano, Bernard, Dorian Williams, who was a rookie, Terrell Dodson, and Tyler Matakevich. That was it. Obviously, the Milano injury happened, so they fortified it with Klein. And then Spector came back from his injury that he has every year, and he was playing for like 6 or 8 weeks before he got hurt again. So that was, then it was Milano, coming back himself, but, didn't end up making it back. So then it was just Tremaine Edmonds, prior to having Tremaine Edmonds, like a guy like Edmonds and Milano. Now you're going to Terrell Dodson with Terrell Bernard, and then you have Tyler Matakevich. It was a disaster, guys. So I can kind of see why, and it cost him. It really did. Like, I thought if they had competent linebacker play in that game, I thought it would have been a little bit different. I don't know how much, at least a little bit different. And that's all that the margin of is for these games, to have a little bit different of a situation, especially in a position that Andy Reid likes to attack, notably the linebacker position. And then late in the year, you're still looking at Spector and Klein. It's just not good enough. It's just ultimately not a good enough unit. And I just think they truly thought like what they see from Andreessen, and it's not about stacking the market. It's just they thought maybe he'd get claimed. They want to develop him further. That's definitely not a this year move, I don't think, but did show that maybe I am a this year type of player. And that's what really started to press their hand on making sure they had to go heavy at linebacker at the expense of a Kingsley Jonathan. Well, they kept Tuhill anyways, maybe at the expense of a Hardy or Hamler, who they're going to have on their practice squad anyways, or Zach Davidson. They just said, you know what, Andreessen did enough, more than, to our opinion. We have a better chance to get back Davidson on the practice squad. And maybe they really did. Kevin felt like Andreessen would be one of the top of the list for getting claimed with his preseason performance. And they made their decisions accordingly through waivers. But we're going to get the practice squad officially here tomorrow. We're going to have some news break all night, probably, if the Bills are interested in other teams' players. That stuff tends to break, especially veterans, as you've already seen Tim Patrick going to Detroit with his next selection. So you're going to get news like that throughout the night. And then obviously all of our shows here coming up this week, we'll have all of our opinions and thoughts, each the hoof. You got so many podcasts coming up here this week. So everybody's going to have their own opinion on how this goes. And they're going to have a little bit more data in how this practice squad turns out. And probably a few more players that could be available for each of those if they make a move or not. So Kevin, final thoughts. I know you want to talk about QB2 a little bit. We kind of breezed over it. I kind of touched on it briefly. What is on your mind when it comes to QB2 to bring us home?
Well, I want to talk about this first, and then I'll get my final thoughts, if that's okay. So if we can carve out like an extra 5 minutes just for this, because I think it's important.
Go ahead.
I tweeted this earlier today, and I said 5 players who I'm going to keep an eye on. Number 1, Bailey Zappi, who got cut by New England. Number 2, Tyler Huntley, who, you said Cleveland kept him. So that's 4 quarterbacks right there. And number 3, Taylor Heineke with Atlanta. And then I put for wide receiver Noah Brown, who was cut by Houston, and then Terrace Marshall Jr., who was released by the Panthers. So do any of those names stand out specifically for quarterback. Both of you guys can answer. I mean, would Bailey Zappi? Would you guys be intrigued with that? Because right now, like Zappi seems like a better option than Trubisky, but like we don't know the severity of his injury. It's just like these injuries are concerning, and Trubisky wasn't even the best when he was healthy. So I mean, are you making the call to Bailey Zappi? Are you trying to trade for Huntley? Are you trying to see what Atlanta's willing to give up for Heineke? What are we doing here?
Dave, go ahead. What's your thought?
Zach Wilson.
Zach Wilson too
would be one that I would try to go after. I mean, he's third on the depth chart right now, so I don't know if Bean wants to get rid of draft capital. I mean, we saw him make a trade for 2026 draft pick, for a return guy in a depth DB. So I guess anything is possible, but we don't know. It's hard to make a guess about this because we don't know what's going on with Mitch, right? We haven't gotten any news of if he's going to be out 2 weeks, if he's going to be out 4 weeks, if he's ready to go week 1. Like, we don't know. And then you have the other side of the coin where people are like, it's backup quarterback. We have the most durable quarterback in the NFL. Well, you know what? If Josh Allen gets injured, if it's for a short period of time, whether it's a concussion and he's out for a game, or it's something where he's out for 2 games, you want your quarterback to win one, your backup quarterback to win half of whatever that is. If it's 2 games, you want him to win 1. If it's 4 games, you want him to win 2. If it's the season, okay. If Josh misses 15 games, fine. Let's call it a wrap, pretty much, right? I mean, we can still try to be competitive, but like let's be real. So it's a big deal, but it's not. I did like the Trubisky signing, to be honest. I didn't think that he had fallen to where he's at now, honestly. I know in Pittsburgh when he came in and he tried to, whenever they had injuries or when they named him the starter after a while, I know that there was issues. But now it just seems like I don't know, maybe the vanilla offense that they were calling, just he wasn't involved. He wasn't just into it. Or he's just that bad. He's gotten that bad. I don't buy into he's Josh's buddy and we're just paying a guy to be Josh's buddy, right? We're just paying a guy to go hang out with Josh in the film room and, be cool with him on the practice field and have cool handshakes with Josh and just make sure Josh is taken care of, right? Like, we could get Matt Barkley for that. Like, let's get somebody in here that if we need him in a pinch, like a game or 2, like, or a half of a game, say Josh goes down in the first half and it's a tie game against the Dolphins. We want a guy that can come in and play the offense. He can run the offense, right? So I think it's important. I just don't know where Brandon Beane, and I think that the way they value Mitch Trubisky is different than the way we value Mitch Trubisky, if I'm being honest.
He gave a 2-year contract.
What? Yeah. So I think the way that they look at him, what he means overall, is more than what we value him as, if that makes any sense. Like, I want a quarterback that if Josh goes down, help us win a game or 2. And there's plenty of guys out there that can do it. I'd love Zach Wilson in that role. A lot of people don't like him, but when he came in for what was the Jets last year, he won games for the Jets last year that he had no business winning.
The season opener against us.
Exactly. I try not to bring that up, but yeah, Bailey Zappi, I think he could come in and be serviceable. There's a bunch of other guys out there. Huntley is another one. I know Kevin Massare, you like him. I mean, it's all what Brandon Beane wants. And until we know further about this injury to Money Mitch, like I don't know where we go, where we guess. But I think if he is out, I don't want Ben DiNucci as the backup quarterback. I don't. No knock on Ben DiNucci. I think he's a practice squad guy that if you need him, he's like break glass in case of emergency quarterback. But I think there's other guys out there that you can get at a reasonable price, if that answers your question.
Kevin, who did you whittle it down to? You said Bailey Zappi. Who else was on your list?
Well, when Dave was talking, I started thinking, I didn't see all the cuts yet. Was Kyle Allen cut?
No.
Or Case Keenum?
No.
Okay, I didn't want those guys anyways, but I thought it's interesting.
But no, they were capped. Actually, they capped Kyle Allen in a complete shocker. They put a Keenum one on the IR though, so he's on that season-ending IR.
I mean, I'm definitely making the phone call to Bailey Zappi just to see if there's some mutual interest. Huntley and Heineke was capped, right?
Well, there you go. We may have an early report from Lance Nelson, our own Lance Nelson. So it looks like Mike White may be the decision.
So what happens when he sees Matt Milano in the hallway?
That was always going to be
He
the
signs a
joke, right?
contract because he's so scared.
When he was cut, I was like, well, watch those two reunite. I mean, the difference was that was a clean hit. If that was a cheap hit, I would say there may be some problems.
You can't tackle a man any more perfect than that. It's perfect.
So ultimately, I would think Mike White's like, yeah, man, you crushed me. I don't know how you did it, but
that's a good one. I would take Mike White. I think that he's a very serviceable backup quarterback for sure.
So that's an interesting perspective. I don't know for what though, like for the active roster. I mean, I don't know how they're going to negotiate that kind of he apparently already visited him too. So
unless they're waiting to announce tomorrow that Mitch is going to go on the IR,
they could,
you know what I mean? And this could be sign Mike White for, I don't know, 4 weeks and then push him down to the practice squad and see what they can do with Ben and
I think most
from DiNucci.
Yeah, most fans forgot that you can actually still IR somebody. So just because they've only IR Darrington Evans so far and Matt Milano doesn't mean you can't use 3 or 4 or 5 more. And it was always likely that based on what Dr. Kyle Trimble said that, you know, even if it's a week or two, the Bills got to shut him down for 4. They just don't have the competitive roster spots to hold him. Maybe he's ready to back up Josh week 3. Like, no, they don't really have that competitive spot. And also they don't want to designate him for return for sure. Those probably only need to designate him for return if something else happens. So like, why not stash him away? Like you're already paying him. Like you don't need to have him. Like we've seen what he can do. It's nothing special. So you don't need to have him ready. I just ultimately think you can call him back off of IR if something was to happen at the quarterback position anywhere. But ultimately, you don't need to guarantee use one designate for return spot unless you ultimately need him. So you might as well hold him, then put him on IR. You don't even need to do a parking lot cut. Throw him on IR because clearly Mike White's not visiting, already in town to be here for fun possibly on the practice squad to start maybe. But like the Bills clearly wanted to tick above Ben DiNucci. He played well. They wanted to tick above Brown. And maybe they were going to think about a tick for these guys anyways when you had Trubisky not performing. McDermott can say whatever he wants. Trubisky looked terrible. I know it's just preseason. In case Keenum's looked bad, Kyle Allen's looked bad at times. Just went on preseason. But Trubisky just didn't look like he had anything. He was holding the ball way too long. Like none of it made sense. So Mike White could actually possibly be a real backup option. Kevin, was he on your list or what were your thoughts on Mike White?
He was not, but I'm just seeing now that it was Tom Pelissero and Field Yates 5 and 6 minutes ago who reported that. So, yeah, I mean, I think Mike White would kind of fit that category. I don't know if he's better than Bailey Zappi. Honestly, I think Tyler Huntley would probably be my favorite option, but you would have to give up a draft pick for him just because he can emulate what Allen does and you wouldn't have to change your offense. But if you just want to sign someone and not have to give up that draft pick, yeah, I mean, I think it's a toss-up between Zappi or Mike White.
Okay. Oh, we don't know yet. I mean, maybe it doesn't guarantee Mike White will be the one. It could be Mike White, or it could be. So there you go, Kevin, right in the middle of our segment. So it could be Mike White. They could still hold off for Bailey Zappi. Maybe they wait to see what happens on waivers first or some variation, and then they go ahead and make their decision on quarterback. What's up, Dave?
Let me ask you this, too. Can Mike White hold for field goals and extra points?
Yeah.
Who knows? Generally,
Sam Martin could be the problem. I'm not just trying to throw this stuff out there, but Sam Martin could be the problem. Since he's been here, that's when the decline, I think, started happening. I'm not throwing like conspiracy theories out there or anything.
Wouldn't they have caught him though? Martin's not a good enough punter to hold. If he was just like the best punter in the league, then you got to deal with it.
I don't know why Sam Martin's still on the roster, if I'm being honest with you. Like,
they guaranteed his salary.
Punters will fall out of trees like the whole offseason, and you can just sign them off the street. That could be better than Sam Martin. I don't know.
I was surprised that they cut Jack Browning as quickly as they did because I thought he was good competition for.
And he could do kickoffs too. Yeah, he could do kickoffs. He could kick field goals. He could kick extra points. He could punt. Do all that. So I don't know. It's interesting.
I think we'll see what happens. I wouldn't say that this is a shutdown case. One of those spots that I didn't have on my practice squad, they could end up finding the best punter to place on their practice squad with one. They've done it before throughout McDermott's tenure that they've had a guy sitting on practice squad at the punter position. So I wouldn't totally count that out yet. What they could be doing from the punter position. But yeah, that's a meaningful point. But my counter argument to that would be like, then I want Sam Martin gone You're telling me that nobody in that building, Sam Martin got paid his guaranteed contract in March. That's what ultimately cared about this. The Bills didn't seem to care about guaranteed money and the signing bonus, a guarantee for like Lyle Collins, but they sure do care about it for Sam Martin, who, I mean, is just nothing special. Actually had a better preseason than I thought he would have. I thought like he could have played his way off the roster. And according to Ralph Wilson Sr., listener of our show, he's held for some of the best kickers in the league. Never had a problem before. And I believe that that's true. That was one of the strengths that was supposed to be of Sam Martin. So I would envision that both, I don't really trust him, but both Matt Smiley and Sean McDermott, is that it's not a holder problem. I do trust that it's not a holder problem. It makes sense that it would be, but I do trust that it wouldn't be holder.
I think it's just a mental problem for Bass. I can't remember who said it today, but someone, was it Sal Capaccio, that said that before he was just like drilling field goals. Like he would just use his leg strength. And
that KC game got to him because he didn't really miss that much this year. I broke down his kicks because I was curious at this fascination. He only missed kicks against the Giants. He missed one extra point and then he missed something in that Eagles game. He didn't miss that many kicks. It was just a couple of games with bad elements. And was really good beside that, and then missed the one kick against the Chiefs. And then, obviously had a little bit of issues in the playoffs in general. The weather elements were terrible in general, but like I was there, like it was just cold and maybe just not his element. No, yeah. It wasn't anything special, but it's still not easy in those elements to kick important field goals, like very, 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 very cold. Like your hamstrings need to be as loose as being a former kicker. Like there's so much that goes into that, that you would think just because there's not any wind, and there still was gusts, because clearly he is compensating to the right. It's not that he only kicks to the right. He's clearly guiding to the right based on what he believes, Highmark Stadium is going to give him a little bit of a boost. So he's kicking it to the right, thinking that there's going to be a left wind gust. And he's not coming. He's not playing it right. It is mental in some capacity from the kicker position, but you don't just forget to kick. All it takes is having a really good game week 1 against the Cardinals to remember, like, it's 90 out. It's like really hot. This is easy. This isn't going to be a problem. And he missed that one from 51 that he should have had, but ultimately, like, he really hasn't missed anything that important. And I don't care what his practice numbers, like when he misses kicks against the Cardinals, like that's when I'm going to be all over him. So if he makes those, I don't really care what he did all preseason. We talk about Deion Dawkins last preseason sucking. I remember him being really bad in the preseason last year. Like, is he even here? It just doesn't overly matter. But when he starts missing kicks against the Cardinals, then we're going to have a conversation about, like, now we're going to be looking at holder. Now we're going to be looking at everything. But Mike White being the first rumored quarterback in Buffalo, he's on a visit too, which is a little bit more than just a rumor. Probably a guy looking to sign based on how these waivers and injuries play out over the next 12 hours. But Kevin, wrap us up. Give us some final thoughts for the listeners. We really appreciate all 700 live viewers here sticking with us for over 90 minutes on the Cut Down Day edition of the Going Deep Buffalo show, brought to you by the Summit Center and Dave Dengler and Larson-Timko. What do you got for us, Kevin? Bring us home.
Well, that being said about Mike White being in on a visit, I was just going to finish by posing the question to you guys if we're comfortable with this Bills offense the way it is, because that's been a huge talking point all offseason. And I said this at the beginning of the show, and I'll say it again. Like, I see the vision. I see what Joe Brady's trying to do. I understand. Like, MVS, I think that was like the cherry on top for the offense. When they drafted Keon Coleman, I didn't really understand at first, but then, you look at Matt Collins and the other wide receivers that they brought in, and it's like, okay, they're getting guys, these bigger bodied wide receivers. They can help block. They can help pave the way for the run game. They have a unique skill set. They can do multiple different things, like Curtis Samuel, perfect example, quintessentially with Curtis Samuel. They have running backs who can not only be good running backs, but they can be good receiving backs as well. And that's why you draft someone like Ray Davis. They're going to be running 12 personnel with the tight ends. But to our conversation earlier, as much as I see the vision, I'm not sure if they're executing it to their full potential right now, considering the injuries to Curtis Samuel, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, and Quentin Morris. And again, with Mitch Trubisky, the backup quarterback, because if something happens to Josh, who's going to be able to give them the ball in the first place? So they're spreading themselves thin. 23 offensive players, 8 pass catchers, 5 of them are healthy right now. I think that Mike White report is hopefully the first domino to fall. And I guess I'll leave it at that.
There you go. Dave, any final wrap-up thoughts for on the Cut Down Edition show? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was a little concerned with just the 5 wide receivers, but there's obviously a philosophy that they're running with. Let me ask you guys this. If you saw after this season was over, you saw Josh Allen's stat line, and it's very similar to 2019 Josh Allen's stat line, would you be okay with that? Obviously, completion percentage would probably be better, and the Bills made the playoffs. Would you care about where the passing yards went, where the passing touchdowns went, as long as the Bills were winning games and they got in the postseason, and, things like that?
11-6. I'm assuming 11-6 roughly.
Yeah, 10-7, 11-6. They make the playoffs.
Okay.
However that is. Would you guys care? You probably wouldn't care about Josh needing to have 4,000 yards and 45 total touchdowns and all this stuff. We probably wouldn't care, right? So I think we might need to be prepared for just a more efficient Josh Allen who's also going to hand the ball off a lot. I think we need to be prepared for that. I think there's going to be weekly matchups with the 5 wide receivers that they have. They're not, no two are alike. Like there's not 2 guys at the wide receiver position that you can look at and say, Khalil Shakir is like Keon Coleman. Keon Coleman is like, you can't do that. They're all different, and they've built this offense to have that on purpose, to for mismatches and things like that. They've based it off a skill set. And that's why I always pounded the table for MVS. A lot of people don't like him. They compare him to Gabe Davis because of his inconsistency, but he brings an element of length and speed that they don't have right now. So, the only thing I was surprised about with the roster cuts today was obviously Daquan Hardy, it being a little bit more lopsided defensively, but then after thinking on it for a while, like I mentioned, having a defensive-minded head coach, he's going to want what he wants on his roster to make sure he feels comfortable calling plays. We have to remember we have a first-time play caller, on defense too with Bobby Babbage, so we got to remember maybe they're stacking the deck in case that he needs more hands on deck for that. So, no, all in all, I think there'll be probably a couple more moves that'll happen the next probably like 4 to 5 days where somebody falls off a roster and the Bills pick them up and stuff like that. And just need to see what's going on with Mitch Trubisky. And then like the Mike White thing is very intriguing because I would take Mike White over Mitch Trubisky. I think that would be a very serviceable backup. Unfortunately, you're going to have to get out of the Mitch contract. It's some decent money. But no, all in all, I think I'm pretty thrilled with who we have. We have to remember too, the Bills have a lot of talent on this roster. We talk about this whole transition from last year to here and losing captains and losing all the experience, but we got younger and let those guys play. Like we've knocked McDermott for so long for not playing the rookies and the young guys. Well, now he has to. So let's develop these guys, coach them up, and see how we do.
There you go. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in for an hour and 45 special edition Tuesday show of the Going Deep podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Massare, Kevin Siracuse, special guest, Dave Myers. And you can find us on all of our network shows across the platform all the time. We have triple coverage live Friday at 7. We have so much different content as I've gone over here. But Founders Pod this week, Dave?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what's going on with the
possibly.
Okay. Me and Akeem, our schedules are so conflicting right now because of work and personal lives. So I'm going to try to put something out tomorrow since you guys slid into Tuesday. I might try to get something going for tomorrow night just to get some fellas talking about more of the roster stuff and things like that. So we'll see. Stay tuned.
Also, Izzy, shout out to Izzy. Izzy show too, live on Sundays. So lots of good content that we have all across the network. But lots to talk about this week. What a great week! So thank you all for tuning in to this special edition and breakdown. Really, we broke it down everything that we had, and there's going to be more content. So maybe you'll see some shorts or some lives. If anything crazy happens, one of us will pop on live throughout the week. But thank you all for tuning in. I'm Kevin. That's Kevin. That's Dave. We'll catch you back at our normal time slot, but really important to be here. And next week, we're going to probably have a Cardinals guest to break down some real regular season football. I'm going to bring on one of my favorite Cardinals guests to talk about what's going on there. They have some injuries. That defense looks beat up over there. They have a really young, nice looking offense, but we'll see what the Cardinals can do. But that's going to be a talk real football next week, Kevin. But from the Going Deep podcast, we'll see you guys next week. Talk to you soon.